Senior Centurion JT Mackenzie wasn't a happy man. As the Senior Centurion, his first cohort was always the first boots on the ground. This was done to immediately have senior leadership on the field until the Commandant or another senior officer arrived to take over. Being the first full cohort on the ground meant they were to secure the landing zone and then fan out to recon the area, not only checking for enemies in the area, but also good campsites with water, good defense points, etc. This allowed the Commandant to hit the ground running, so to speak, but once it was very literal, when the enemy shelled the LZ. So far, the operation had proceeded smoothly. Once Commandant Garcia touched down, he took the first cohort on the initial recon of the area. However, this meant he was still checking the area when the Commandant took the second, third, and fifth cohorts out to teach the Gre'l a lesson. The first cohort got back to camp 30 minutes after they left. At first, he was annoyed, but then they showed him the kids. Now he was pissed about missing the Gre'l's first object lesson on why you don't murder kids. After giving his report and hearing her recount what was starting to be referred to as the Battle of Bloody Valley, they discussed how to handle the situation until reinforcements arrived. After chow, the leadership brainstormed the best way forward. It was decided they didn't have the numbers for offensive operations until more help arrived. So the plan was to heavily fortify this settlement and send out units to bring as many settlers here for protection. Things had been going well until a Gre'l fleet showed up in local and the Terran force had to retreat. There was no way to defend the base when they could just bombard them from orbit. So the Commandant moved the column towards the mountains for cover in the system of caves and tunnels under the mountains. The Commandant wanted to avoid the obvious trail that was used to reach the local quarry, so scouts and Kekavuk locals looked for the best route. Once a suitable route was found, the Commandant got sneaky again. She planned on moving the column to the new route once it was dark to hopefully reduce the chance of being spotted by Gre'l scouts. The Gre'l's unassisted night vision was supposed to be worse than even a human's. A breastwork was going to be thrown up to block the main trail. A small force of volunteers would man the position and try to convince the column had gone that way. A false trail was even laid down to reinforce that idea. They planned to brush out the real tracks when they moved out. Once the column was a safe distance into the mountains, the decoy unit would follow when it could safely do so. Senior Centurion Mackenzie took his prerogative not just as the Legion's highest-ranking non-officer, but also having served in this Legion longest of anyone. It took some convincing, but eventually the Commandant gave in and let him take charge of the decoy unit. The Commandant expected heavy casualties, so she asked for volunteers. The Senior Centurion was pleased but not surprised when every Marine stepped forward. It was his command, so he picked 30 from each century. When the Commandant said he could pick more, the Senior Centurion replied, "It just seems right that 300 should hold a pass and buy some time." The volunteers would take only weapons, ammo, and a small med kit along with some food and water. They were issued their sea pills. No Marine would be taken alive. Everything else was sent with the column. The less the Gre'l captured, the better. The Marines pulled out every trick in those centuries of warfare that taught humanity. False campfires, putting out booby traps, trip wires, disguised holes just big enough to catch a foot to one big enough for some Gre'l to fall onto some sharpened stakes. Even the front of the breastworks held a few surprises. Discrete range markers were set for the Marines. Another one was set for the Gre'l. Testing captured weapons had shown that the 200-meter maximum range of their weapon. They were closer in function to old Terran shotguns with their relatively short range, but a lot of damage as they got closer. One of the Marines suggested the final touch, a standard made from some cloth one of the Kekavuk had with them. It was just light gray, but when attached to a pole cut from a nearby tree, it should be enough to catch the Gre'l's attention. A few Marines decided it was too plain and put a skull and crossbones on it. It was silly, but all of the Marines liked it. Even the Senior Centurion approved. Then it was just a matter of waiting for dark. The decoy fires even let them enjoy a hot meal. It was several hours after sunset that the column set out. Scouts made sure any Gre'l that spotted them never told anyone. For the bait unit, there was nothing to do but wait. Weapons were checked and cleaned. The breastworks were improved with a layer of stone on the inside, covered by more dirt. A small redoubt was built to the rear in case they had to abandon the first wall. Once that was done, the senior Centurion had half the unit get some sleep while the other stood watch. They switched after 4 hours, making sure to keep the fires burning. A messenger was sent by the Commandant that the column was starting up the pass and that her scouts got a rough count of the Gre'l. 5,000 in the closest groups, but they could see other groups much further out. The Commandant hoped they could handle that first group and pull back before the other groups caught up. She put a scout atop the canyon wall that the quarry was cut out of. The scout would act like a low-power radio relay. The senior Centurion could talk to the scout, and the scout could pass audio-video to the Commandant or another scout. The Commandant hoped it would let them keep some comms without the ships in orbit detecting the signals. The Gre'l's body temperature was far lower than a human's, so the cold affected them more. They became sluggish, but they could still fight. That had the senior Centurion thinking about making a limited night assault on the camp, but that could go wrong fast with that many Gre'l. So instead, he settled for sending a few Marines out to take some pot shots at the Gre'l camp. It should keep them jumpy. The moment the scouts returned with news, the Gre'l was stirring. The order was given to stand to. The sun was barely up when the first Gre'l scouts appeared. The rest couldn't be far behind. It was time to do the final checks. The first group of Gre'l came into view and shook themselves out for battle. The war leader strode out and lifted his equivalent of our binoculars to look us over. The senior Centurion just flipped him off. Even if the Gre'l didn't know what it meant, his men did. Their laughter helped relieve some of the building tension. One of his Marines started singing the Legion's favorite drinking song, with the others joining a beat later. Their voices echo off the walls on either side. And it's no, nay, never, no, nay, no more. Will I play the wild rover? No, never, no more. Banging their rifles against their armor, and the spot normally clapped. 1,000 Gre'l began to trot forward before making a charge. Fix bayonets! A weapon that was phased out of 21st century armies, came back once humans went to the stars. Modern technology made them extremely useful against aliens that relied on natural armor like the Gre'l. They were able to punch through the gaps between plates, but the Marines kept singing. I've been a wild rover for many's the year, and I spent all me money on whiskey and beer, but now I'm returning with gold in great store, and I never will play the wild rover no more. The Gre'l just passed the 600-meter mark, and it's no, nay, never. No, nay, no more. Will I play the wild rover? No, never, no more. The Marines roared it even louder. The Gre'l passed the 500-meter mark. The singing died down as the senior Centurion gave the order to wait for his command before firing. 400 meters. The Gre'l give a wordless shout. 375 meters. Fire! The front rank of Gre'l falls like a poleaxed steer. The second rank of Gre'l tripped over the dead and dying. 350 meters. Fire! The next rank goes down like a scythe hit them. Fire at will! The Gre'l begin hitting the booby traps. Slowing or stopping them, they become good targets for the Marines. More and more Gre'l fall to the Marines' rapid and accurate fire. 300 meters. Hundreds of Gre'l are down, the wounded reaching for their comrades. 250 meters. The Gre'l begin to break, dragging their wounded as fast as they can. The Marines fired a few shots to hurry them along, but otherwise firing stopped to conserve ammunition. The Gre'l made several assaults that got closer and closer, but never reached the breastworks. This went on for several hours. The Gre'l attacked, the Marines killed them in swarms, and the Gre'l broke and ran. Then the cycle started over again. So far, only their slow speed and shorter weapon range have kept them from the breastworks, but it's just a matter of time. Yelling their war cries, the Gre'l charged. Marines fired as fast they could without losing accuracy. Gre'l went down and never got up. Still they came on. 350 meters. The Marines' tremendous fire dropped Gre'l by the score. Still they came on. 300 meters. They tripped the last of the booby traps. They leapt the bodies of their fallen comrades. The closer they got, the more damage a bullet delivered. They began to punch through the toughest parts of the Gre'l armor. Still they came on. 250 meters. The withering fire from the Marines drops more and more Gre'l. Some begin to retreat, but plenty continue to advance. 200 meters. The Gre'l got within range and more began to fire on the run. Their weapons weren't meant to be fired that way. Most blasts flew up and were a bigger danger to the birds than the Marines. 175 meters. Some Gre'l slow down to take better shots, but that just makes them better targets for return fire. Fewer and fewer Gre'l get much further, and either try or killed. Flesh can only take so much before they turn and run. A few hide behind the bodies of their comrades and keep shooting, but they are silenced one by one. The field before the breastworks is carpeted with the dead. Still, they came on. 150 meters. Gre'l began stopping to take aimed shots. The Marines made them pay for that, but the Gre'l were starting to hit the Marines. Here and there, a Marine went down. Some were just knocked down by the impact, but still able to get up and fight. A few went down wounded. Their moans, cries, and curses echoed off the wall. The worst were the ones that fell without a sound. Most of them would never rise again. The senior Centurion detailed 4 men to drag the wounded to the Redoubt. A few walking wounded were sent back to protect in case of a breakthrough. Still, they came on. 100 meters. They passed the high water mark of previous assaults. No more bodies to slow them down or trip over. They began moving faster. The Marines could hear the slap of bullets hitting flesh or the pop sound of shots deflected by their armor. Still, they came on. 50 meters. Over 60% of the attackers were down or running away, more dropping every meter they crossed. 40 meters. Marines began hurling grenades into the mass of Gre'l. Bodies and body parts were sprayed everywhere. 30 meters. The Marines discarded accuracy for speed. Gre'l fell faster, but far fewer were kill shots. Some Gre'l even got back up and joined the charge. 20 meters. They were going to reach the breastworks. At least 30 Marines were down and out of the fight. Several more made their way back to the Redoubt, limping or dragging themselves there. 10 meters. Some Gre'l outran the others and made it to the breastwork. They died by shot or bayonet, but that left fewer Marines shooting at the onrushing wave of Gre'l. The Gre'l hit the barricade with a roar, finally able to get to their hated foe. The humans were no less eager to pay them back for those kids in the settlement. Gre'l talon, fang, and tail met Terran bayonets, rifle butts, and hand weapons. But not enough Gre'l made it over the barricade to prevent other Marines from continuing to fire into the oncoming Gre'l. Soon the Gre'l were being set upon by 2 or 3 Terrans. Seeing the failure of their charge, the last Gre'l turned and ran. The wounded were immediately taken back to the rear, but the Gre'l war leader could be sneaky as well. His force was less than 200 meters out. They'd hung back and used the first group as meat shields. Their first volley took down a dozen Marines that were caught away from the safety of the breastworks. The rest of the Marines began returning fire, which took a dreadful toll on the stationary Gre'l. The Gre'l found few targets now that the Marines had taken cover again. The senior Centurion took stock of the situation and knew they couldn't hold the breastworks against that number. He only had about 200 Marines fit to fight at the breastworks, and another handful of walking wounded in the Redoubt. Smoke grenades were deployed between the Gre'l and the breastworks. The Marines grabbed the wounded and fell back to the Redoubt. Several Marines were detailed to grab the rest of the ammo and grenade cases. The Marines fell back and left a gap for those in the Redoubt to provide covering fire. Here and there a Gre'l stumbled out of the smoke only to be taken down by accurate fire from the Marines. As the Marines reached the questionable safety of the Redoubt, the senior Centurion deployed them along the front and sides. He detailed a quarter of the men to reinforce and expand the Redoubt or take care of the wounded. Ammo and water were passed to the front. Marines helped bandage the minor wounds of their comrades next to them. The Gre'l war leader expected the smoke disguised as yet another Terran trick. His troops warily advanced out of the smoke. The Marines fired into the Gre'l as they crept forward. The war leader was in the middle of the mass of troops that only slightly outnumbered the Marines. There were more wounded Gre'l on the ground than upright. At his shout, the Gre'l charged ahead to reach the safety of the breastworks and provide them cover to shoot at the hated Marines. The senior Centurion waited as more Gre'l took cover behind the barricade. Less than 100 had climbed over the top when the senior Centurion triggered his last booby trap. The entire front of the breastworks exploded outwards as the hidden claymores were triggered. The Gre'l weren't just thrown back. They were shredded by 1,000s of dense metal balls that punched through their armor like it was made of paper. A few Gre'l were just turned into unrecognizable piles of flesh. Very few Gre'l would survive even with medical care. The rest were either dead or dying. The senior Centurion took advantage of that to order a charge. A couple of hundred screaming Marines leapt the defensive wall of the Redoubt and charged into the stunned Gre'l. The Gre'l were simply swarmed over and died on the bayonets of the Marines. The senior Centurion went straight for the war leader. The war leader deflected the first thrust of the bayonet, but the senior Centurion adjusted his attack and caught the war leader across the face with the rifle butt. The blow only stunned him for a few seconds, but that was more than the senior Centurion needed. He spun to the right, letting the rifle momentum swing him completely around and add more force to the thrust that sent the bayonet up and under the war leader's chin. He slowly toppled to the ground before the senior Centurion put a shot into the back of his head. To be sure, he was dead. The few remaining Gre'l shouted out in dismay and turned to run, but there was no escape. The rest fell to the thrust of a bayonet or the impact of a bullet. The Marines continued forward to retake the breastwork and fired into the backs of the fleeing Gre'l. Less than 100 Gre'l made it safely out of range. Hundreds of wounded Gre'l lay among the thousands of their dead brethren. The battlefield stench of the dead and dying Gre'l and Marines hung in the air. A miasma of blood, shit, vomit, blasted soil, and the residual smell of weapons fire. But the cost of victory was heavy. Over 100 Marines were down and never getting up. A quarter of the surviving Marines would join them without future medical care. The Marine dead and wounded were cleared from the field between the Redoubt and the breastwork. As much as he hated to do it, there just weren't enough Hail Marines to carry out the wounded, provide security, and bring out the dead. So the dead were taken to the quarry and hidden in a small cavity in the wall. The Kekuvuk had been using it to store tools, but now it held the fallen Marines. The entrance was covered in stone and discreetly marked with the Terran military's emblem of their sun over a pair of criss-crossed ancient weapons, the human spear and the Twi'lek's war clubs. This would help locate the spot when the Marines returned to retrieve their dead. The senior Centurion made sure that info was passed to the Commandant, as well as the video taken by the scout. While that grim task was being done, other Marines built stretchers to carry those too injured to walk. The Commandant also sent 2 sentries back to help take over transporting the wounded and gear from the exhausted Marines. They would meet up somewhere on the trail. She wanted to get the senior Centurion's men to the relative safety of high ground before the other units of Gre'l arrived. They just loaded the last of the wounded onto litters and were starting to move out when the scout shouted at them. He was so upset that he forgot to key his comms before talking. He got it right the second time, and it wasn't good news. The other Gre'l had arrived. They were maybe 1 click from the senior Centurion's position. The Commandant ordered them to get the fuck out of there on the double. But there was no way they'd make it to the start of the trail without alerting the Gre'l to its location. They'd be all over the rest of the column within hours, so he was staying but would be sending his wounded to her. He then shut off his comms and destroyed it. If he couldn't communicate with her, then he wasn't exactly disobeying orders. Senior Centurion Mackenzie looked to what was left of his command and informed his men. He asked for volunteers to remain with him and distract the Gre'l enough that the others could escape, and stressed the meager chance that they would leave the position alive. Every single Marine fit for combat and wounded able to speak up volunteered. This got a very rare smile from the senior Centurion. He sent all the wounded, with some of the more Hail Marines on. He kept 150 Marines with them. All unnecessary gear was either hidden or sent with the departing group. Even personal items were given over to be sent to their families. They said their goodbyes and passed on messages to their friends still with the column. The departing Marines moved as far into the shadows as they could. They made it to the beginning of the trail and started up. Several Marines began to disguise their tracks, and one removed the discreet marker left to guide them. The senior Centurion led his reduced command back into their own valley of the shadow of death. He could not hold the breastworks for very long with so few rifles, and even if he tried, more of his Marines would die when they broke for the Redoubt. So he led them back to the Redoubt and began strengthening it. More rock was brought over to reinforce the front wall. The last of the ammo was handed out. The last of the grenades were placed along the front wall. The standard was placed in the center of the Redoubt. The last of the food and water were shared amongst them. Some wandered off to take care of personal business. There was nothing to do but wait. A knelt in prayer, and others rechecked their gear. A pair of Marines found a marker in their kit. It was normally used for marking equipment, but they found a new use. They used it to make their faces look fiercer. Other Marines joined in until all but the senior Centurion wore what one Marine called their death masks. They were still young, so doing something weird wasn't unusual. But fuck it, they were going to die here, so no reason to be serious. The Gre'l finally reached the entrance to the canyon. Up above, the scout used hand signals to inform the senior Centurion that an estimated 10,000 Gre'l made up this force. The senior Centurion told the Marines to sing again and attract the Gre'l's attention. He expected them to sing Wild Rover again, so he was understandably startled when they began to sing an old lament instead. It brought a startled chuckle when the senior Centurion realized what it was. A few of his Marines were even smiling at him as they sang. Lay me doon in the Col Gruon, wara for money mare have gone. Lay me doon in the Col Gruon, wara for money mare have gone. When they come, I will ston ma groon, I'll nae be afraid. The Gre'l began to shake themselves out in a battle line. Thoughts all hame tekawa ma fear. Sweat and bluid hide ma veil all tears. Ains a year say a prayer for me. Close your een and remember me. The Gre'l shouted and loped forward. Ne'er mair shall I see the sun, for I felt a German's gun. Lay me doon in the Col Gruon, wara for money mare have gone. Lay me doon in the Col Gruon, wara for money mare have gone. The song was very old and commemorated the death of the composer's great-grandfather during a 20th century war. It was written at the end of the second millennium. It's even been used in video entertainment of the time. It was a very fitting song about a man who died because he wouldn't leave a wounded comrade behind. The song was named Sergeant Mackenzie. The Marines opened fire and many fell, far more came on, but they couldn't put out enough fire to stop the charge. The Gre'l reached the remains of the breastworks, and some took cover to fire at the Marines but flowed over it like a wave. The Gre'l got off a few shots that just made the Marines duck before they could fire without hitting their comrades. The Gre'l crossed that last bit of killing ground to engage the Marines. A few Marines kept firing into the mass, but most dropped their empty rifles for their preferred melee weapons. The Gre'l were just as willing to go hand to hand. They preferred the excitement of close-quarters combat to shooting from a distance. The Gre'l flowed around the sides, and then behind the Redoubt. Gre'l talon, fang, and tailspike met human bayonet, sword, and axe. The Marines stood their ground, swinging, shooting, and stabbing. But for every Gre'l they killed, there were 3 more to take their place. The Gre'l began to chip away at the number of Marines left. No quarter was given nor asked. Wounded Marines weren't spared, but torn apart. Red and green blood soaked into the dirt as the combatants surged against each other. The Marines were pushed back into an ever-shrinking circle. An island of humanity surrounded by a sea of Gre'l. The Marines fought with the fury of those who knew they were doomed, but still fought against it. But there was no escape for the Gre'l in the front lines either. They were unable to fall back due to the other Gre'l pressing to go forward. Any wounded that fell to the ground were quickly trampled by the horde of Gre'l trying to reach the humans. After what felt like hours but was less than 20 mins, less than 20 Marines were still standing. There was a small pause as both sides caught their breath. One of the injured Marines used the standard to keep him upright. Senior Centurion JT Mackenzie of the Terran's 1st Marine Legion told the last survivors that it had been an honor to lead them and to die with them. The Marines gave a loud war cry and didn't wait to receive the enemy's attack, but charged straight ahead into the startled Gre'l ranks. Several fell before the Gre'l closed in on the last Marines. The final few Marines fought to take as many Gre'l into death with them, but one by one the defenders dropped. The standard fell into the last knot of Marines. The senior Centurion was the last to fall. The Gre'l roared with victory. The scout slipped away and joined the party of wounded Marines. They soon met up with the party of Marines sent back to retrieve them. When they heard it was over, every surviving Marine burned with the desire for revenge, but the Commandants ordered them to retreat. The slight hint of sorrow in her normally sure and steady voice would stay with every Marine who heard it. It took another 10 hours to reach the safety of the caves. Once they were far enough back in the caves, the Commandant gave the order to rest. Kekuvuk, Marine, and animal dropped where they stood. exhausted, footsore, and thirsty. Most of the Kekuvuk and their animals fell asleep almost immediately. Only the discipline of the Marines kept them from doing the same. Once the tracks were erased, the entrance hidden and sentries posted, a side cave to use as a privy was designated, and a rotation was set, the Marines finally got to find a spot and sleep. The Commandant couldn't sleep until she finished one last task, listing the names of the fallen in her report. Then she could sleep for a bit, but she was up when the guard was changed. They stayed in that spot for almost 6 hours before eating and getting ready to move further into the system. While that was going on, the sad task of packing up the personal belongings of the fallen was done. It was another 24 hours before the Commandant found a place to set up a more permanent camp. 36 hours after the battle, the Commandant led a double handful of Marines back to the battle site. They moved at night with the scouts using both night vision and thermal to watch for Gre'l. The stench of death told them when they reached the quarry. The Commandant sent out plenty of scouts to look for any sign of the Gre'l. She gave them 20 minutes, but the only thing found was a very faint thermal signature near the front of the canyon. The Commandant and a dozen Marines rappelled down instead of taking the chance of revealing their path through the mountains. The rest were spread out to provide covering fire if needed. The battlefield was quiet and dark. They slowly crept towards what had been the Redoubt. She could just faintly make out what looked like a pole with a cloth stirring below something bigger on top. She spread the Marines out further and they moved forward. They kept low in case they missed any Gre'l in the area. A startled oath let her know someone tripped over a Gre'l body within meters of the Redoubt wall. The Commandant halted while one of the Marines crawled into the Redoubt to find bodies everywhere, all Gre'l. He didn't find a single Marine in the Redoubt, which made no sense. He'd seen the footage, just like everyone else. There should be over 100 Marines in here. He picked his way to the pole, what he assumed was the standard created by the now dead Marines. His gaze followed the pole up and cussed when he saw what it was. It was the senior Centurion's head with their banner beneath it. It wasn't until later that one of the wounded confirmed that it was originally a shade of gray, but was now red from the blood of fallen Marines. A Marine along the canyon wall found out what happened to the rest of the Marines. They'd all been decapitated with their heads stacked into pyramids, but the bodies were still missing. They got their answer at the breastworks. The bodies were stacked around a cleared area in piles. At the center was the remains of a large fire. Upon inspection of the bodies, it was discovered that all of them had organs removed, heart, livers, and spleens. Closer inspection of the area around the fire confirmed the Commandant's suspicions that the Gre'l had removed and consumed them. She assumed it was retaliation for her actions after the Bloody Valley battle was over. She'd regretted what she'd done in a fit of rage with the bodies of the Gre'l they killed. Ironically, it wasn't revenge but a form of honor to the dead Marines. Like many ancient human societies, they followed the belief that consuming the hearts and other organs passed the former host's strength onto them. The Gre'l only performed this ritual with parts from the strongest foe. But that wouldn't reduce human anger at the breaking of not only a major taboo, but one of humanity's oldest fears. The Commandant wished there was time to bury their dead properly, but the sun was already starting to crest the horizon. So like before, they located the spot and hid the bodies of the fallen. And then she ordered them up and out of the quarry. For whatever reason, one of the Marines had brought the standard with him. The Commandant also took the time to send out a message with her report and the attached video of the fight and aftermath. She reasoned even if the Gre'l noticed the signal, they already knew where the canyon was. The return trip was far quicker without the civilians slowing them down. After that, it was just a matter of fortifying their camp and exploring their surroundings. Then they were just waiting for the cavalry. And then the Gre'l would get a lesson that payback was a bitch.